And joining us, my good friend who I literally met on the air during the Women's College World Series, former Stanford Cardinal, great all-conference performer, played at Stanford from 2009 to 2012. She's been a Pac-12 Network analyst, podcast host, just finished her second season, as we'll talk about that momentarily. I speak of our good friend Jenna Becerra, who's with us back here on In the Circle. How you doing?
I'm good. I'm super excited to just talk softball again. It's crazy because people don't realize it's like this is a year-round thing. Softball is, and so here we are in the end of 2021, and we're still talking ball, getting ready for 2022.
That's right. You just finished your second season of hosting. Tell us about the podcast for those that may not be aware, because you just finished your second season. We're going to get more into your podcast later in this interview, but just kind of tell the audience where they can find the podcast. You just finished your second season.
Yes. So it's called Bleav In Softball with the Bleav Podcast Network. That's BLEAV. And you can find it anywhere you get your podcasts. We're also on YouTube, so you can watch the episodes too, which is super fun and was like a super fun upgrade that we had in season 2 compared to season 1. And yeah, just talks all things softball. I've had Eric on the show, so if that's not motivation enough to listen and watch, I don't know what is.
She's had more important guests than me, though. Don't worry. Like Natasha Watley's of the world, tons of people on including Mike Candrea. And that's a good segue because I want to talk about first the top stories of the year in softball 2021. I will ask you in a little bit about what's your top story, but obviously the one that jumps out to me among them is Mike Candrea retiring at Arizona. And I think you had him on right after he retired. You were one of the first people to talk to him after he retired. He did his press conference, things like that. You played against him. You've covered him. To me, that's how big of a story is that? That's the thing that jumps to me. When you think of this Mike Candrea retirement, of course, making the Women's College World Series and the speculation that Caitlin Lowe will take over. What's your thoughts on that story, which to me is one of the top stories of 21?
I agree. It 100% is one of the top stories of 21. And not just because of what he did in the college softball world. Like the reason to me that it's such a massive story is because of everything that he did for the game globally. I feel like I can say pretty confidently that anyone who has played, is somehow connected to the game of softball, has been, if not directly, at least indirectly impacted by Mike Candrea easily. Like he has just been the face or the father of softball is what I called him on my podcast. And I just feel like that is the way to describe it because he really took softball to what it is today.
What was your big takeaway when you talked to him? Because like I said, you were one of the first few people to talk to him after he made the announcement of his retirement. What was your big takeaway in talking to him?
I know it was one of those things where I was like, yeah, I'll reach out. I doubt I'll hear back, but I'll throw it out there. He can reel it in if he wants to. And it turns out I got a response and we actually got to chat, which was really, really fun. Probably one of the best episodes in terms of like how honored I felt doing them that we've had on Bleav In Softball. But I think my biggest takeaway was just this balance. And I saw this competing against Arizona too. I mean, they were a bit of a rival of Stanford's, like when I played in Pac-12 softball. But I think just because we met them a lot in postseason as well. And then of course there's the Pac-12 rivalries of old. But to me, it was like this balance of humility, but also with just relentless pursuit of greatness. Like there's somehow in Mike Candrea and in the Arizona program and the USA program by kind of default because of his leadership, this balance between those two things and an ability to turn it on and off on the field versus when you walk off the field. That's, I think, what's interesting to me. I remember talking to Calista Balco, who was an All-American catcher that played for Mike Candrea. She came on the show. She talked about him a lot specifically. They talked about this like pit bull mentality a lot. And when they'd walk on the field, they were mean. And she said she'd meet people in person. And honestly, maybe even me too, like off the field, you talk to them and they're like, wow, you're so nice. I didn't realize you were such a nice person because of the way you play. And I feel like that came from Mike Candrea, just like this balance of being able to be that good person, but just this pit bull on the field and being able to have both of those things within yourself.
Do you remember the first time you met him or maybe, play? Because obviously you played from 09 to 12. You played against Kenzie Fowler, your colleague at Pac-12 Network, when they, that 2010 team that ended up playing for the national championship against UCLA led by Megan Langenfeld. You picked a What a time you were to pick to be in the Pac-12 there. But what do you remember the first time you either met with Coach Kendrea or talked to him, either on the field or off the field?
That's a good question. I think the first time that there was anything in person had to be when we played them first my freshman year. And I do remember kind of in general that year being like, wow, yes, I'm used to seeing these people, including some of my own teammates. Like I remember Maddie Kuhn was a senior when I was a freshman, and she had just been at super regionals at Texas A&M, and watching her on TV. And then you see people like Mike Candrea, and you even see like Heather Tarr and like some of these other coaches in person, and you're like, wait a second, they're not only do I get to play on the same field as them and their players, they're actually they're scouting against me. Like they're trying to pick me apart and try to figure out what my weaknesses are so that they can pitch to me a certain way and whatever it is. It was a little bit surreal. So I would say that sort of like good game handshake afterwards, the first time we ever played Arizona in my collegiate career, was probably the first interaction that I had. And at the time, some of our coaching staff were also had been coaching with Candrea on the USA team. So there was some style similarities in terms of coaching, and even just down to mechanics and things like that they would teach.
It was really wild. I had a similar story to you from a podcast standpoint. I remember back in 2017 in the fall, we reached out to try to get him, and we're thinking, yeah, we're not going to get a response, no answer. And then when we found out, we got the email like, yeah, he's good to go. He wants to do it. I told our, Vic, our co-host, I called him and I yelled at him, we got Coach Candrea on the phone. And we're just yelling at each other. Like, I can't believe it. Like, it was kind of crazy. And then we had him on, and he was, and this, having talked to him, he's not shy. He will tell you how he feels, and he'll talk forever. And I always appreciated that of him. And obviously now Caitlin Lowe takes over. I just recently spoke to Caitlin Lowe about that, about taking over for Coach Candrea and the responsibilities in that role, because in that Arizona role, it's not just coaching your team, but it's a lot of people are, that program transcends softball. So people want to know the coach's opinion there. And that was something I talked to her at length recently here on our show and in the circle recently. What's your thoughts on Caitlin Lowe getting taken over?
I love it. And I love it for a few reasons. I think one of the things that stood out to me the most, and I keep saying this, I feel like every time I talk about Caitlin Lowe, but I think it was just such a tone setting thing that she shared with not only the U of A softball community, kind of the softball community as a whole, but also U of A athletics, I think, because not only was Candrea a pillar of the softball community, but he was also a pillar of just Arizona Wildcat community, like in Tucson. He had been there for so long and was such an example for a lot of other coaches as well, for other sports. But I think for me, I love the move with Caitlin because of her experience too. Like I'm not a believer that somebody can be an excellent player and play at the highest levels and done everything that she's done, which we could go on for hours talking about her accomplishments. I don't think that automatically means that you can be a good coach. Like this is a different skill set, being able to transcend like what you know and what you practice on the field and actually share that and teach that and exude that. And that's different, but she had experience working with Candrea. She knows the program as an alum herself. There's just nothing like that. I mean, you can do a great job as a coach coaching somewhere that you didn't go to school. That I'm not saying that's not possible, but there is a different level of just commitment and investment and a feeling of home when it's where you played. And it's the, you bleed Arizona softball, right? Like it's just a different vibe. So I like that she had the experience. Like she actually had those years under him and had a big impact. She knows the culture, but I love the fact that she said herself, like, I promise to not be the greatest imitation of Mike Candrea that I can be. I'll promise to be like the best Caitlin Lowe and the best coach that I can be. And I think that is such an important distinction because you can't just try to copy someone else. Like that's how you fail. And I think she understands that right away. And I think Coach Candrea understood that right away and had the faith in Caitlin because of that mindset. And then you look at the staff that she's built. I mean, yes, Taryn Moat was already there, right? But like they have that relationship of playing together, coaching together, like so many layers. And then you bring in Lauren Lappin, who knows what it's like who was a teammate, from a USA perspective, but then knows what it's like to play in the Pac-12 and walk those, that path as well. It's really cool. And the fact that the Pac-12 is now has so many female head coaches, and also a lot that were alums of their schools that they're now coaching at, is a pretty cool way for them to be a leader in softball as a conference.
Yeah, every coach is a female, and I Bleav like 2/3 of them are alma mater, coaching our alma mater, including obviously Jessica Allister at Stanford, Chelsea Spencer at Cal, Kelly I at UCLA, now Caitlin at Arizona, Amy Hogue at Utah, on and on and on. How big, you live in that world, you live in that bubble. How big is that? Is that talked about a lot internally in there? What do you sense that covering the league, we're having coaches that coached in their respective alma maters?
It is. I think it's increasingly being talked about. And it's talked about, at least in my kind of circles of conversation, because I always talk about it and I always ask about it. So I get them to talk about it. But I think, like, for example, I've told this to Chelsea Spencer over at Cal. Like, I really like her energy. I was like, I don't know if I've gotten along with like a Cal Bear this well before as a Stanford Card, like forever, Cardinal forever, But I like her mentality. And I think she kind of summed it up well, where it's like she has a lot of respect. Like, if we think about the classic Stanford Cal rivalry, which is just one example of the rivalries that exist in the Pac-12, she was talking about how there's so much respect, but at the end of the day, she's like, yeah, I want to beat Stanford always, and I think she talked a lot about, in particular, how of course it's different when it's your alma mater. You do your best no matter what, but it's just a different level of investment. It's just a different level of, also, like, if we think about off the field things too, I think when you are part of an athletic department and you talk with like other coaches, and you just have a deeper relationship with the school, the athletic department, and then there's the athletic director, right? And that's how you also get growth. I think not only are these head coaches able to relate on like the best type of level with their current student athletes, but they are also able to push for more for their student athletes. Like Cal, I don't know how long it took, way too long, for them to be able to build a new field and a new stadium. They're finally getting to do that. Arizona, it took Mike Candrea, 8 national championships just to finally be able to get that in Tucson. It's crazy, right? And some of that's a push from the SEC and other conferences that are making that investment. But I think when you have somebody who actually competed in that uniform, being able to make that case for their student athletes, I think that goes a long way too.
One of the other head coaches in the Pac-12 that coaches at our alma mater is Heather Tarr. And I think, to me, when I think of 2021, one of the other top stories was her taking over as the U.S. national head coach for Ken Erickson. U.S. obviously Olympics this past year, U.S. getting the silver. She takes over. I recently talked to her in length, and she was very passionate about taking over Team USA and what she thinks is her vision for USA softball, and balancing that with Washington, where obviously she's coaching. She was very clear to me on the episode in the interview about that. She also had to make some changes on her staff during all this, which was kind of wild. What's your reaction to Heather Tarr taking over the head coach of Team USA?
I think it's a good move. And I will say the balance of being able to maintain excellence at your school of choice and also being able to push for excellence on an international level is not a new thing, right? Like, we're talking about Mike Candrea, it's like that's what he did forever. And he, I think, was able to take some of those things from the international game to make the college game better, his team better as well, things that you learn. And I would say that, given Heather Tarr's experience being on the staff for Team USA, but then you take a step back and you look at her perspective. I've always felt like she's had such an international perspective, even from a recruiting standpoint with the Huskies. You think about the connections that you even have to Team Canada between UW and the Canadian softball team, with people like Danielle Laurie, Jen Salling, even Victoria Hayward, right? Like, some of these greats, she's always kind of had that broader perspective. And then you look at it in modern day UW players with Gabby Plain from Australia. Like, she's always had that sort of, she's always seen the bigger picture, in my opinion. So I think that there's a lot of change going on at once. Like, that's definitely like not easy to navigate, but there's something to be said about her being very well equipped to manage that.
Yeah, she was very passionate about it. Want to make it clear, she's going to be balancing both, and obviously, it's going to be interesting. She's got a new staff. JT D'Amico moved on to Georgia. She brought in her new staff. So it was fun. And she had to do all that during the Olympics. And she talked about that with me, which was kind of wild for her 2021. That was her 2021. Those are my couple of the stories that stands out to me. What are some of the stories of 2021 in college softball that stands out to you?
Well, obviously I have that sort of Pac-12 perspective, but I have to say on a more national level, I think the James Madison story is just so important for so many reasons. I feel like these mid-major teams have been knocking on the door for a while, and James Madison was sort of the culmination of people realizing that, hey, this is the real deal. Like softball is a very fast growing sport, but there are some tangible kind of pieces of evidence that you can see along the way as we're growing that really show that. And I feel like having a team like JMU, a face of that team like Odyssey Alexander, be able to do what they did under the circumstances in which they did it was huge for that. And it finally everyone, it's like, I feel like these mid-majors and people who just really understand the game have been saying these things for a long time, but it finally became mainstream that people realize you can do this. It doesn't matter. And I'm a huge believer in, like, I don't really, in some ways, in terms of coverage, I find it very interesting. I love talking about it with you and on the air and all these things about rankings. But as a player, you can't care about that stuff. That is noise when it comes to what you're actually doing on the field. And so I think to see a program like that and coaching like that was definitely, without a doubt, one of the best and top stories of 2021.
No doubt. I mean, JMU definitely became a national story, to the point where even now with realignment, JMU was brought up in the Sun Belt press conference with JMU about a big factor for them going to the Sun Belt Conference. I had Lauren Laporte on recently. She talked about how things have changed from that standpoint. She gets more speaking engagements because of it. She just talked about the overall landscape of how, reflecting back on that run, which that's going to be remembered forever, right? Like I feel like every now when you start season 3 and we get starting the season, I think one of the questions we're going to be asking is, who could be the JMU of this year, right? We're going to be asking that now until somebody else does it.
Yes. And I think that is going to happen until it becomes the norm, right? It's like, until there's going to be JMU, then it's another team might do something similar. Then it's like, oh, who's going to be X this year? And then if those things keep stacking, then all of a sudden it's not as much of a surprising story as it is like, okay, this is part of the game.
Agreed. And I think that's one of the bigger stories on the college landscape. Obviously, we talked international. I want to ask you about the pro side, because you cover a lot of Athletes Unlimited, as do I. You interviewed a lot of the players in Athletes Unlimited. They just finished season 2. They've announced they're going to have season 3 and 4, and there's some big news there. They're adding Rachel Garcia, Sierra Romero among the faces they're going to be seeing. I think Bubba Nichols will be back. Just your thoughts. What stands out for you from a pro standpoint in 2021 here in the States? Because obviously that's always been a focus. There was an announcement earlier this year about potentially a pro league starting up with USSSA involved. Lauren Chamberlain's the commissioner. We don't know a lot of details there, but obviously we do know Athletes Unlimited will continue, and they're even expanding on their schedule. What's your take from the pro season?
I'm excited about it. I think Athletes Unlimited was fortunate in the sense that the infrastructure and the way that they're built, and being in one location like that in Rosemont, was able to withstand the challenges of COVID because of the way that they had already structured their league. So in 2020, we got to see Athletes Unlimited basically be this bright spot for the softball community, because we missed out on most of the NCAA season. I mean, the short season that we got was incredible, but we missed out on so much softball. We missed out on the Olympics, and then Athletes Unlimited, we got to get something in the end of the summer and the fall. Like before the end of the year, we got to see some amazing softball. And I feel like they showed that there is interest, that there is demand. And not only that, but the way they treat the players, that is just a continuous theme that comes up every time I talk to an AU player, is that they feel like real professionals. They're treated in a way that they have never truly felt before. And then you fast forward to 2021, and they were able to repeat and even go further with just the show that they put on, some of the players that they got, like some of these people like Odyssey Alexander, like some of these NCAA stars getting the first collegiate draft that they ever had in 2021. That was then a bridge between how can we capitalize on this college success that we're seeing in terms of viewership and interest? How can we push that into the pro world? Well, there was a bit of a bridge there this year. We got to see that with Athletes Unlimited. And then you have the news that now they've actually signed people to a 2-year deal. And in the context of male sports, baseball, football, whatever, that seems like pretty basic. But for softball, that's huge. Softball players have not been able to have that kind of feeling of stability. Like, wow, you mean I actually know that I'm going to do this for 2 more years? Like everything is usually like a day by day sort of thing, especially since COVID. So that is another huge stride, I think, into being like a legitimate pro league. Then when you look at even that 2-week kind of AUX like mini season that they're going to have right after the College World Series, I think that's interesting too, because you take that momentum. People are usually like, wow, I really miss softball. Like there was so much on this past week. What am I going to do now? Well, there you go. You have it right there for you. So I think there are some really interesting moves being made. I think Athletes Unlimited was initially meant to be a supplementary league, not a competitor to the NPF before the NPF shut down after COVID. Now with the WPF that Lauren Chamberlain is involved with, I think if they're able to get up and running and have a little bit more of that sort of centralized professional league feel, not the, quick 5-week, 6-week season, if we're able to have both of those things, I mean, that is softball February to October, in a year. And that'd be huge for the sport.
We have enough players to pull it off. Will it be run well enough? I think that's always been the question, right? And I think that's going to be the big questions there in the pro side. Plus, the thing that also is interesting, we had Kat Osterman retired in 2021 with the Olympics and Athletes Unlimited. Danielle Laurie, what a great comeback story she had. I know you spoke to her about it. Jen Salling, what a great comeback.
Yep.
Et cetera, et cetera. We lost for a minute. To me, those are some of the big stories for 21. It's kind of my big question moving forward, Jenna, is who is the next Kat Osterman? Not from the standpoint of the face of the sport. A lot of people think it could be Montana Fouts, for example, right now in the college game. Rachel Garcia, perhaps, who you could argue has been the face of the college game the last few years, and perhaps as she moves now with Athletes Unlimited, and hopefully if you get the Olympics in Los Angeles and she's still a part of that, maybe she's the face. What's your thoughts on that as far as the face of the sport? Because every sport always has a face of the sport, right? Whether it's the NFL with Tom Brady and Patrick Mahomes, the NBA with LeBron James and Steph Curry, softball. I think that's the key too that I'm really interested to see now. I feel like Kat and Monica for many years have been the face of the sport. Jenny Finch thrown in there. We see them all the time, whether it be at they transcend softball. Who's that in your opinion? Do we have that?
Well, I think this is a great call out, first of all, because 2021, as we're kind of highlighting the top stories, it is this mix of this, what's up and coming, but then also these players that have really made softball what it is and came out of retirement, let's say like Danielle Laurie, Kat Osterman, to come back and kind of finish their story with the Olympics. But now they're gone. Like we've had the pleasure of having them forever. We've been able to watch, and they've been able to kind of hold softball up. And that's who we've depended on for that. But now it's like, okay, well, who's gonna step up? I do think the factor that I think is thrown in here that makes it a little bit different. Like the formula is not going to be the same, basically. What the formula was in terms of how Kat and Danielle Laurie and Monica Abbott all became the faces of softball is not the same as how the next group will become the faces of softball. It all starts with talent, obviously. But in terms of like name, image, likeness, I think that's going to make things incredibly different. Not something Rachel Garcia had, really, right? Like in her career even. So not only is it different from the Kat and Monica's, it's different even from Rachel, who just finished her career. So I think Montana Fouts has been killing it in terms of what she's been able to do from an NIL perspective. I think there are pros and cons to name, image, likeness, like anything else. But I think for women in particular, because a lot of female athletes have a large social media following, for example. There is interest. I think it can actually even the playing field a little bit more with some of the attention that the male sports get. So from that perspective, Montana Fouts feels like a natural Jenny Finch-esque type of face that can emerge from softball. And I find it fitting, and I think the story is really cool that was her hero, or the person that inspired her also. And then here it comes all the way back around to where she may become that person for younger softball players. And I think that even makes it more exciting. It makes her more interesting to the softball community and to the sports community. So I think she makes sense. I think this next season, and it being the first time we're really going to see like NIL in actually happening, will maybe determine who else will emerge. I think it's interesting because you could have an Odyssey Alexander type, come and become that face. I mean, I think she is a face of softball right now, right. Even so, and so I think it's going to be interesting because I think certain new faces could come out of nowhere and surprise us this year. But I think the natural one, you can't count Montana Fouts out.
And softball, I spoke to a couple compliance people at different schools in major conferences, a couple different conferences, just to see how this name image, like, because they're right, that's another big story of 2021, in college athletics. And I asked them about how that's going, and they said the three most popular sports that they've gotten requests and demands about name, image, and likeness is football, men's basketball, softball. That, to me, speaks volumes to me. And if you look at softball every time during the World Series, it dominates social media. I think the players, as you know, are so good on social media. They understand how that works. Not that other athletes don't, but there's a connection there between the softball and social media that I don't think is there, quite honestly, with women's basketball or volleyball or even baseball. I was told there's not a lot of requests for baseball. I think softball can benefit from a popularity standpoint because of name, image, likeness. Because you said now, it feels like, and based on talking to these compliance people, I think people in the business world and all these people understand that softball's a hot product, and you can identify with a softball player like the fans identify. The TV numbers are through the roof. The coverage is bigger than ever, and I feel like that's where softball players will, and that's why I think this is a big positive. Softball is a big winner in name, image, likeness. You agree with that?
I think overall, like, it's net positive. I do think there are going to be challenges in terms of team camaraderie, because it is, while name, image, likeness can be an equalizer for women's sports as compared to male sports, it's less of an equalizer within a team. If certain players like have certain deals and others don't, and I think that's going to be a new layer that coaches are going to have to navigate and that players are going to have to wrap their heads around. I think at the end of the day, though, the great players are able to, again, kind of cancel out the noise and focus on what needs to be focused on. But it is going to be a new element that has to be dealt with. Overall, though, I think it's a net positive. I think we just have to make sure that we handle any of the challenges well, so that we can keep it positive.
Do you worry more about name, image, likeness, or the transfer portal? Which, that's another story in 21. We've now gotten used to it, but there are still lots of moves going on in the sport every time. And that kind of affects a locker room, right? Like, hey, if I'm not played. So it seems like, I guess that would be my counter. If somebody's not happy, now they can bolt. And they can bolt at a moment's notice. And we've seen that across the sport. What's been, including some of the stories of 21, Allie Shipman, who, when people think the name Shipman, you think Tennessee. She's now at Alabama. Miranda Ellis, who did not play in 2021, is now at Oklahoma State. Julia Cottrell leaves Florida for Oklahoma State. Those are just some of the transfers. There's a ton we can go over, but it'll take a multiple podcasts to break them all down in that way. I know Texas has added Haley Docini recently from Fresno State. So the transfer portal in college athletics, including in softball, and softball was kind of ahead of this. They were first. Now everybody in football is like, whoa, I can't believe what's going on here. Well, you clearly were in softball, but is the portal maybe a more of a bigger risk for you're talking about from a locker room standpoint than a name image from that standpoint?
Yes. So I If I had to choose, probably. And I don't know if that's because I come from a slightly more old school background where, you're loyal, like you work through it. And I think that's another thing. I can understand if you make a choice, you go to a school, it's not exactly what you thought it was going to be, it doesn't pan out 100%, that's okay, you make a change. I also don't think people should force things that don't work, right? So if you make that change, it makes sense for you, it makes sense for the new program you're going to, that's cool. I think where you lose me a little bit is when people transfer more than once, like multiple times. That's where I'm kind of like, this is a little bit out of control. Now with COVID, I can understand though, like why there'd be a little more activity than pre-COVID, just considering, do people even have funding to keep players around, et cetera. So it's like, I can understand it, but I do struggle with the constancy of the transfer portal, because I do think, I feel old saying this, because it's like, I think kids need to learn how to like work through anything difficult versus just kind of giving up and bailing. But it's true. I mean, I talked with Morgan Riley about that, just in terms of her experience, like when she came from Fresno State and then went to ASU with following Coach Ford. She was like, that worked for me. Like that was the right move for me, but I don't like necessarily go around telling everybody like, yeah, you should leave. If it gets hard, just bail. Like you don't need to be a part of it. Like it should be very thoughtful, and it should be only because it's right for you. It should be for the right reasons, I guess, is like the bottom line. So I do get worried about it though, because it feels like it's pretty easy to just kind of like bail.
Yeah. Now the counter argument would be, hey, coaches can leave whenever they want to. So
Yeah.
who thinks of the players when the coaches leave? And we're seeing more and more coaches taking other jobs because there's more money, and which is a good thing. The one tweak I'd like to see, I don't like the transfer portal players leaving after the fall. Like I feel like that's kind of late. Like I feel like there should be a window where you could transfer, and I think obviously the rosters are so out of whack because of the COVID extra year and things like that. So you kind of get that. Some play, look, if player doesn't want to is not going to play. Sometimes coaches are very honest with the players too. They're like, hey, we just don't have room for you to play here. So it'd be best if you moved on, and they help them go somewhere else, either because that's how they honestly feel, or maybe they want to make room for somebody else, whatever it is. So there's a lot. It's both sides. I do wish though that we don't see players transferring like in December, and then all of a sudden they're eligible to play the next month for a different school. That feels a little off kilter. Just my opinion. Now some would argue, hey, what if I have to, in some players' cases, I'm finishing school and I'm going to grad school, which is kind of that gray area, because a lot of players, especially, this started in basketball. Basketball started this, and I think every other sport has kind of saw the blueprint, which is if you get your degree, you can move right away to your master's some other school if that's what you choose to do. So it's a very gray area.
Well, I think that's a little bit different though, right? Like
Yeah.
if it's a degree program or a specific program of higher education that you're doing, I think that's a little bit different. But yes, if you're just in undergrad and you're doing the entire fall semester or fall quarter for some schools in one place, and then all of a sudden in January you're in another place and you're able to play in February, that feels off. I agree, because I don't even think it's setting the student athlete up for success. You're in an entirely new environment, sometimes like in a new state. This is a completely new school system, like everything's new. And a month later, you're already playing. It just doesn't feel right in that way. It also, I don't know how you're supposed to it'd be really difficult to gel with your teammates. And what if you come in and you take a starting spot that people worked really hard for in fall ball. Fall ball is an underrated part of college softball, in my opinion. It is a huge part to development as a team, as individual players, just in so many ways. Is that what brings a team together and makes players better for the spring season? So to not go through that together, it just doesn't, I don't think it leads to as good a softball in the spring.
Yeah, but I don't know if it's going to change anytime soon. I think this is not just a softball thing, by the way. It's a college athletics deal. We're seeing this all over the board. So it just so happened softball was kind of the first one that was kind of in the trial period on this. Any final thoughts on 2021 that you will think back when you think of 2021? Any other thoughts you think back when it comes to softball in 2021?
I think 2021 has just been a conclusion and a turning point for softball all at the same time. And I do think it has to do with a lot of the things that we mentioned in terms of the great players who played late into their careers, into their 30s, some pushing 40, even into their 40s, that have now decided to leave the game, but also this amazing talent that's coming right out of college into the pro world, and then even more talent that's still coming through the college scene. I just think it is a shift in our softball community and in probably just the type of play that we're going to see as well. But I think it's been such an interesting year because of everything that got pushed from 2020 to 2021, where we kind of got to see the end of people's stories finally, see things play out, get some closure for people like Kat Osterman, right? But then we also are going to get to see new beginnings. So it was just an interesting time to be a part of the softball world.
It really is. It's tremendous. It's getting bigger and bigger every year, and the coverage is getting bigger and bigger. We're speaking with Jenna Becerra here on In the Circle, and that's kind of what I want to move to now, because obviously we've had you on multiple times. We've never really dug into your career, because I feel like your career is fascinating. And so I've really wanted to know this for a while, but every time I've had you on, we've talked about, games out that's going on. God forbid. But I want to get to this because I do think I see a growing trend now, and I think more and more players coming out of playing college and former players retiring see the media now as an avenue, where I don't think that was the case a while back. So I'm fascinated how you got into it, but I first want to go way before that. What got you interested in playing softball to begin with?
Yeah, well, I started playing when I was 4 or 5. So I think for me, my dad played baseball growing up, and he had actually taken me to the local high school game just randomly. And I think this would have been Camarillo High School. So this is where Jessica Mendoza went. She's from my hometown too.
Whoa,
so,
okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is where she went to school. I don't think she was playing in this game, but I went to watch and I said, Daddy, I want to do that. Like, that's what I want to play. And I tried a bunch of other sports too. Like I tried basketball, volleyball, gymnastics, soccer, but softball was always the one that I came back to. Always the one where I was like, yeah, I do want to play all-stars. I want more softball. Like, sign me up for that. And so my dad, coming from a baseball background, ended up being my coach for a long time. He coached, was the head coach for a few rec ball teams. He kind of observed my first T-ball year just to see what it was like, and then started coaching after that. But by the time I hit high school, he wasn't my team coach, but he was still my personal coach kind of throughout high school. And honestly, even in college, especially when I was home for the summers and even in between games sometimes in college.
That's pretty remarkable, Jessica. I've had Jessica on here multiple times on the show, and her dad was her coach, and I think that's what's one of the interesting things that's changed about the game. The players today don't necessarily have to depend on their dad anymore to be coaches, because there's so many now lessons. You could get hitting lessons, pitching lessons all over the country, all over the world, right? That's kind of one of the big changes now. Do you ever wonder, like, man, I wish I had this when I was going playing that these players have now from a technology standpoint? There's so much investment in the game.
Oh, yes. I mean, honestly, even I'm at my parents' house in Camarillo right now visiting for the holidays, and I used to practice with my dad, especially in college, across the street at Cam High. And they had batting cages, and, it was pretty much just, there were fences up and a couple nets, right? Now they have like this AstroTurf and everything's so nice over there. And I'm like, man, if I would have had that when I was training, like, could you imagine? But I think that happens with everybody. I remember some of the alumni saying that to us at Stanford too. If we got like a updated locker room or something, they would say that and we'd be like, oh, okay. And now I say it about the current players. So it's just part of the game. And it's like, that's what you want. You want it to grow, but it is amazing, all the things that are available now. It's crazy.
How did you end up at Stanford?
Well, I remember my biggest goal at the time when I was being recruited and when I finally hit high school is I really wanted to play Pac-12 softball. And at that time, like, that was the pinnacle of softball too. Like, almost every single national championship at that point had been to a Pac-12 school. So, and with the Camarillo connection too, I actually do remember like when I was still playing rec ball, even before I was at recruiting age. Um, my dad like was acquaintances with Jessica Mendoza's dad, and I do remember he was nice enough to kind of get Jessica to sign a softball for me and say, I think he says like dream big or something like that. And at the time, I remember thinking like, oh, wow, this came all the way from Stanford. And I thought it was on the East Coast for some reason. I was so young. I had no idea what I was, I didn't know what was going on. And I was like, this came all the way across the country. This is so cool. Because it was actually like a Stanford Pac-12 softball, NCAA softball. So obviously, not long after that, I figured out where Stanford is and that it's in the Pac-12. And I think for me, the biggest thing was I was very dedicated to academics as well. And I just, even before I actually went and visited and actually became a part of the Stanford alumni community, to me, I was like, this school has some of the best athletics and some of the best academics. I truly didn't, and this is easy to say when you went to Stanford, but I truly didn't see another school that was like, Ivy League level academics and then, I don't know, SEC level athletics, like it was just seemed like the best of both worlds. And I didn't see how any other school could measure up. So for me, at least for me, so that's when I was like, I really, once I started getting recruited and actually talking with the coaches and things like that, I was like, yeah, this is where I want to go. And I visited, and I always talk about, especially when I ask some of my podcast guests, like about the first time that they visited their schools, you get that like warm, fuzzy feeling where if this is right or not. And I had the warm, fuzzy feeling. And that's been a thing I've used kind of throughout my life to figure out when something's the right decision. And I had it. And so I made the commitment and I did it.
How influential was Jessica to you playing softball, to going to Stanford, and to your broadcasting? Because you've mentioned her now a couple times. There's a lot of connections there. It feels like you were inspired in some ways by her. Yes? No? Like how was...
Oh, yeah, of course. I think honestly, at the time, the entire USA softball team was an inspiration to me. Like I've said this before too, but I still have the Sports Illustrated magazine, the edition where it had the real dream team on the cover.
The 04 one, yeah.
Exactly. Like they really were. They were. I mean, it was like gold every time. And that was at the height of softball in the Olympics at the time too. So I think that entire team was an inspiration to me. And then when you have somebody who is from where you're from go to where you want to go in terms of school, it certainly makes you think, well, I can do it too, right? And so I think that's something that Jessica has always wanted to do in her career too. And I think it's safe to say she does, which is she wants to create that path so that other people know that they can walk it too. And I think she did that. And of course, she was one of the people that did that for me too. I mean, because this is Southern California, I also remember going to a UCLA alumni game and getting a ton of autographs. The only time in my life that I ever felt starstruck was when I met Lisa Fernandez when I was 10 years old. That's the only time where I truly was like, and like couldn't really speak. And it was at that alumni game. And so I got her autograph and like Stacey Newman, Natasha Watley. And I've actually told Stacey and Natasha this, like, hey, I still have your guys' autograph from, years and years ago. And then, fast forward to now and we're chatting on the podcast, right? It's a pretty cool, I don't know, cool full circle moment for me. But I think that USA team probably was like the most inspirational. And then being able to kind of meet some of them and actually make it feel real was definitely huge.
It's tremendous. It's a legacy team. I mean, I had Coach Flowers on this summer, and she has that framed photo, that Sports Illustrated cover, in her office. She showed it to me. That's the beauty of Zoom. I can see some of this. But, Mendoza is one of the few people I've interviewed hundreds now. I mean, we've been doing this podcast since 15. One of the few people that gets me intimidated or like, ooh, I better like make sure I got everything, is Jessica. And I remember, because I covered her when she played for the Pride here in Florida.
Mm-hmm.
And I would fill in and do a lot of broadcasts for them. And I would do some post-game stuff. And one of the games I did an interview. And I remember, it's on YouTube. People could find it. She's got her son, who was a youngster at the time. And I'm nervous. Yeah. I'm like, oh my God, I got Jessica Mendoza. and it's like, it was like, whoa, and she would play, I see her in person. She just had that presence that was just kind of like in awe. A person I recommend you should get on season 3 at some point is Sydney Ball Malone, who's like one of her best friends.
Yep.
Jessica was a catcher of hers in California.
Yeah.
So I've talked to Coach Ball Malone about a lot of the Jessica stories because it's a fascinating story. They know each other very well,
Oh yeah.
growing up and things like that. And they both obviously were recruited by John Rittman, who you played for as well. But she covered the Olympics this year. She covers Major League Baseball. She has set a high standard. And that school in Stanford, her and Ramona Shelbourne. I don't know how aware you were about her and obviously what she's doing in the NBA, but they were obviously part of that first Stanford team that made the Women's College World Series. How often do they come up at Stanford, either when you were playing or once you thought about getting into broadcasting?
Quite a bit, actually. I remember at the time, in the early part of my collegiate career, Mendoza would come and practice with us sometimes because she hadn't stopped playing yet. They were right when I started my freshman year, where they were coming off the 2008 Olympics. And so she was still playing professionally. And so she would come take BP with us. And even she was in the outfield, right? And she would take fly balls with some of the outfielders. And she was like, just kind of we were like, all right, yeah, Doze, like, go Jess, whatever, the same way we would for anyone else. So she was definitely present. And then Ramona was at a lot of the alumni events. So I remember meeting her pretty early on as well, like when the alumni weekend, let's say. And I remember even there in the beginning, this kind of faded away. Everyone preferred just having a barbecue later on, but we used to actually play a little bit like an alumni game. And I remember Ramona just having a blast, and I'm still in touch with her every now and again now to talk broadcasting journalism. I have a photo probably from like 2013 where she brought me on to the ESPN set in LA, and I'm sitting at the Sports Center desk with her, from a while back. And so she's great about that. I think she's super helpful, and not just the Stanford people. I remember having Kayla Lombardo on the show, and I think especially from a journalist perspective, writing, like she's gotten a lot of advice and guidance from Ramona too. So I think they've both been very present. I think they both now, their careers have taken off so much that they'd love to get back to Stanford more than they've been able to. But
Sure.
Historically, like when I was there and in general, they try to do it as much as they can.
Ramona is like if you ask me who's the one person you wish you could get in this podcast, I haven't had a chance to get yet. That's on the list because I met her because I covered basketball. I was like her. Yep. I covered the NBA. That was always my goal, my dream. It wasn't, softball kind of happened. Right?
Yeah.
Basketball
right.
was always the goal. And for a long time, I balanced basketball and softball. There would be many times where, I think I told you the story when I was on with you, the reason I started doing softball play-by-play is because it fit with the NBA schedule. So I could do a soft UCF game early, then go to the arena to cover a Magic game, which was my job at the time. Yeah. And Ramona back then, obviously she covers the Lakers, still does to some degree. She's in a big presence in LA. So she would come down every time the Lakers. So I would meet her once or twice. But she's always been the one I've wanted to talk to because we have the similar common ground of basketball and softball. But I've not been able to because in her defense, she's busy. She's winning either around the horn or she's covering big stories. So I'm very jealous of you that you get to talk to her. So I'm very envious of you right now. That's a really good get. But it's pretty remarkable, and I will never forget her and Mendoza being so outspoken and excited when Jessica Allister was named the Stanford head coach. Obviously, it was her teammate. They were part of that 01, so that makes a ton of sense. But still, it shows you the passion they still have for the program. And I remember even ESPN a couple years ago would play that clip from the World Series of Stanford LSU. I think they collided in the outfield, and they still laugh it off. But I've always enjoyed that passion there that they have for the sport and obviously for their program at Stanford. And clearly players like you have benefited. They've played at Stanford from that standpoint.
Oh, 100%. And they're both, it's funny too, because the more I meet, especially some of the Stanford alumni who played on those teams together, like in that same era of Stanford softball, like I had Dana Sorensen, who was an outstanding pitcher, who threw to Jessica Allister and was on the same team at the time, like some overlap. And the competitiveness that's there is all the same, like in all of them. They're very kind, very nice people, very friendly. And then once you start talking about softball a little bit or get into it, like you can feel that competitive drive. And it makes sense. Like I remember, I think I told Dana, I was like, I can 100% see how you guys went to the World Series. It makes complete sense because Jessica Allister is one of the most competitive people I know.
Yeah.
And to where it's like, you don't really want to be around her if they lose, like it's not her best moment. Like she needs her space, and Dana's got a little bit of that too. And you can see that in Jess and Ramona, and you can just tell like what that common thread is, which is pretty cool.
Very intense, competitive person, very smart. I've
Yes.
interviewed her a bunch of times on the show, and she's awesome. I just had a great talk with her in the Fayetteville region on all the obstacles they had to win through. But I remember on the show, I interviewed her right after she took the Stanford job and left Minnesota. She wasn't really a fan of talking about it, right? So she kind of did like a Bill Belichick on me a little bit. But she was respectful. It was great. I had to ask, and this now being a media, there's some questions you just have to ask.
Yeah.
It's like the elephant in the room. And she understood that. But I've always been impressed with her. But you're right. She's even when she does interviews, you can sense that intensity in her.
Oh, it's all business. Like you can even see like on Pac-12 networks and stuff, when you do the mid or in between inning interviews with some of the coaches, that she is very much like, I'm going to answer your question. Okay, now I got to get back to business, and then duck out. Like that's just her style, but she also knows that it's part of the job and it's part of also promoting the Pac-12 as a conference, which all the coaches collectively, especially this last year, that was another thing that came out of 2021 to me, was this want and need to do that more in today's world. So
let's talk about your playing career. An infielder, all conference not mentioned. Kind of like your teams were really good, but you kind of ran into some bad luck. Like in your freshman year, I Bleav, you're hosting Arizona. It's a classic super regional. Goes down to a game 3. You lose by a run. 6-5. 2010, you run into this team known as Hawaii that would go on to get to the World Series and shock Alabama. And, kind of was, the biggest story that year. 2011, you were part of one of the greatest super regionals ever played against Alabama in Tuscaloosa at the Roadhouse. You were so close. You had a great run, made the tournament all 4 years. You had to end your career in Lafayette with those wild fans. Just describe your 4 years there. Some great teams. I know you're probably bummed out you didn't get to the World Series. You were that close, but still a lot of positives there. But yet, it was. You ran into some interesting teams, historic teams, really.
Well, so first of all, Eric, now I am triggered by everything you just said. So I'm going to need to recover for a second, but no. But it is one of those things where that super regional, my freshman year at home against Arizona, and the one in Alabama, it's almost like it's forever going to be too soon to talk about in some ways. Sure. But I think, you know what, I would say my freshman year team. So this is when like Maddie Kuhn and Missy Penna were seniors on the team. And you had myself, like Ashley Hansen, Sarah Hassman, like we were the freshmen and more. And in between you had some greats too, like Alyssa Haber, like Shannon Koblitz, Rosie Neal. Like there were just some great players. I think that is probably the best team talent wise, and even really ended up to be in the results that I played for during my collegiate career. And it was crazy to be able to do that right away, your first year. And they had just went to super regionals the year before and played at Texas A&M and almost made it to the World Series and didn't quite. And then we came back in 2009 and ended up, we were ranked number 2 for a while that year in the country. I think that was one of our best records ever, something like that. I don't know, whatever the stats are, but it was just one of the best teams, I think. And we had that year, we had actually beaten Arizona in our Pac-12 series. We had beaten Washington in our Pac-12 series. Now, later on, we end up hosting Arizona, and we had all kinds of thoughts as to why, we're 8, they're 9. How could that be? Blah, blah, blah. But it is what it is. I think we have done other episodes on the seeding. So that's a whole other conversation. However, we ended up hosting them. And then we were 2 outs away, I think, from winning that second. We won the first game, 2 outs away from going to the World Series, lost the second game, lost the third game the same day. Fast forward to Alabama in Tuscaloosa. pretty much the same story. Won the first game, shocked everyone because that was not what everyone thought was going to happen, and the fans were crazy. But playing there was awesome. Also, like what a great atmosphere. Then we same thing, lost the second game and then the third game in the same day. So now I'm very grateful that these teams get to play that third, if necessary, game on a different day, because I do think that we would have been in better shape to potentially have won if we didn't have to play that in the same day as the second game. However, those are both, tough for us to look back on as a team, even to this day. But I think really cool experiences. Like you mentioned, even like playing the Hawaii team my sophomore year, we opened that season. We always went to the Kajikawa tournament every year that I was playing. And that year we actually didn't. We actually flew to Hawaii for our very first opening tournament of that season and played Hawaii and then some other teams that were there. And I remember we were telling the freshmen, like, don't think this is how every season opener is. Like, you don't get to go to Hawaii every year. Just know that. But we, so it ended up being this like really cool kind of full circle moment where then we're playing Hawaii in postseason. And so we started and kind of bookended our season with that team. And Stephanie Ricketts was awesome. And I've had Kaylani on the podcast, and she's talked about her sisters and what a cool story that is with that family. And then you look at senior year and like, yeah, we ended in Lafayette, which in terms of fans was a really cool, like we had people tailgating our softball games, which is just not something you see as much like at Stanford, at least. But it was really awesome. Like the atmosphere, being able to do that too. So I would say it's like, I've been to so many states and all because of softball, and a lot of states that I wouldn't have necessarily thought. Louisiana, like maybe one of them, but it was a cool place to be able to, I don't know, kind of have the team there. I definitely didn't want to lose the way we lost, but
Right.
All of these experiences, like I think I appreciated being able to see softball in other regions a little bit more.
Well, in Lafayette, it's one of those schools that it's a softball school first, really. And that's not like lip service. Like they have a passion for that sport to the point where like I just had Jerry Glasgow on, and the numbers go through the roof anytime he's on the show because people are interested, very interested, like passionately insane. And you mentioned the whole Arizona Stanford thing. We still see that today with the conference super regional pairings. The committee always likes to claim, oh, it's just random. But we all know that's not. That's not. And I'm not going to delve into that more and more. And that Alabama series on television was dramatic. Like, I think that really was the series that kind of got the Roadhouse out there. Like, people talk about, wow, what's a great place to watch a softball game, the Roadhouse. You know, and I've talked to Murph about it. He brings that super regional up as really the one where everybody got to see, like, wow, what a softball environment. And to a lot of extent, a lot of programs have tried to copy that. And that's why we see all these facility upgrades across the country now, is because it's become a spectator sport. People want to attend softball games. And I think it's a lot people point towards that matchup on television, how great it came out.
I mean, I think that's completely fair. And it's like, you also have to remember that at that point, the SEC, that was 2011, had not won a national championship yet at that time. So that didn't happen until the following year in 2012 when Alabama did do that. But at that point, it's like that was sort of that was in the rise of the SEC. So to be able to see those facilities and the investment and everything that you just said, especially for people on TV and all of that. Yeah. I mean, I think to me too, it's like, I do feel a little bit of that like Pac-12 SEC kind of rivalry is like, well, who's the best conference, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, I feel like the rise of the SEC also led to the rise of softball on a broader basis in the US, at least. So, and even globally to some extent. So I think it was a very interesting time to play, even from that perspective.
I'm trying to remember, was that Adam Amin and Scarborough that covered that Supers on ESPN? I don't know if you remember who were the ESPN commentators, but that was kind of the beginning where you started seeing the growth of the postseason coverage. It used to be, because back then, some of them would be on ESPN, but others would be on school websites.
Right.
But I remember the Supers now, that was when they started investing. I think Amin and Scarborough worked together in that one of those. It might have been that Tuscaloosa one.
I'm trying to remember. I feel like it could have, I don't know if Beth or Michelle Smith were there. I feel like maybe one of them, but you might be right. I don't actually remember off the top of my head. But you are right that I think that was also a time like regionals, no way, nothing was covered during regionals at that time. Super regionals is when you got on TV and when you actually had that exposure. And then, of course, the World Series. But that was sort of newer, like you're saying, like that kind of exposure. And now you see regionals covered, which I love because I think there's so many interesting games that happen at that level to even get to the super regional like phase of postseason. So, but yes, it's like thinking back to just what was going on with softball overall during my playing career, it actually is super interesting. And I think it does give me an interesting perspective now as the game continues to evolve.
So your career's done after 2012. Take me through that process. Once you're done, what did you end up doing after you're done playing? And how did you end up going the media side? Was that something you wanted to do from the get-go? Was it something that evolved? Just take us through now, post-playing career, your journey.
Yeah, so I always knew that I wanted to stick around to do a co-term, which was a co-terminal degree. At Stanford, essentially, you're able to complete a master's in 1 year. And so, and they even let you, like, if you have the space in your class schedule to start taking grad school level classes your senior year. And it's called a co-term because technically you can be getting your bachelor's and your master's at the same time. And at the end of that 5th year, you have both. I kind of ended up doing it standard, where after the 4 years, I had my bachelor's and then I did the 1 year and finished with my master's. And I knew I wanted to do that. I had first heard about it because Maddie Kuhn did that. So my senior year was, or my freshman year was her senior year. And then she did a co-term her 5th year when I was around for my sophomore year. And she did it in the communication department in media studies. And that's what I ended up doing because I knew that I had an interest in it. I knew, in sophomore years when you declare your major, and I knew I was interested in communication. I will say, like, some athletes or people in general would declare communication because if they weren't sure what they wanted to do, because it was a much like more clear kind of pathway than maybe some other more complex degrees. But for me, I was like, no, I actually have a strong interest specifically in communication. And so my 5th year, I was asked by KZSU, which is the Stanford radio station, to cover the softball games. So I ended up working with another broadcaster and we were partners essentially. So in 2013, during that master's year, that 5th year, I did that for the whole season. But even before that, in the fall of 2012, so the fall quarter of my master's year, I actually worked for the Cardinal channel at the time, which was Stanford Athletics YouTube channel. And so I did sideline reporting for the football games and post-game interviews and all that good stuff. And so that's actually was my first like real experience with this sort of media world. And I really liked it. So then I just sort of continued it through the rest of the school year and knew that I always wanted to do it after that. I mean, right after I graduated from that 5th year, I ended up working at LinkedIn for 5 years, did a rotational program, and I was in marketing towards the end. But during that time, I still continued doing some of the radio coverage and some of that, and even some with Cardinal Channel and some of the football stuff as well. But then kind of like felt a little overwhelmed, I think, doing all of it together. So then for a couple years, didn't really do a whole lot of sports, just kind of went as a spectator and continued with my work at LinkedIn. And then in 2018, I actually left LinkedIn, moved to the East Coast in Connecticut, and started doing media more full time. So I continued with Stanford Athletics and then eventually also started with Pac-12 Networks, as you mentioned, and then started the podcast last year. And now I actually, in the middle of COVID, like in 2020, I'm now working with a company that I interned for in between undergrad and grad school, which is a tech company called Chegg that's based in the Bay Area. So I do work for them and I do like marketing and communications. But I also still do Pac-12 Networks, Stanford Athletics, podcasts with Bleav, Podcast Network, all that good stuff as well. So I'm busy.
Yeah. When did you decide to become a podcast host?
It's funny. This actually made me happy because I first saw a job posting on LinkedIn from Bleav Podcast Network. And I was like, obviously I'm a believer in LinkedIn since I worked there for so long. And I just kind of saw the description that they like to have it's not just sports. They do also do things like health and betting and pop culture and things like that. But they like to have people, at least in sports too, who actually experienced it. So they like to have ex-athletes, for example, or ex-coaches or things like that, who can comment on whatever their area of coverage is or whatever their sport is. And I was like, well, this is interesting. And I had been thinking about launching some sort of recurring content series for a while. And podcasting at the time was, I mean, now even more so, especially since COVID happened, but it's a rising medium, right? So I just kind of replied to it and ended up speaking with the hiring manager and all that stuff, and then ended up doing the show. I actually pitched a few different shows, not just softball. I think Eric, you and I have talked like super briefly about our WWE fandom, but
Oh yeah.
I actually like pitched like, hey, I could talk about like the women or whatever. But they were like, but you're the expert in softball. We'd love for you to do softball. I was like, okay, fine. So we'll do softball. So then that's kind of how it started. And then turns out it was February 2020 when I first started. And I think we were like 4 or 5 episodes in, and COVID hit, and it was like completely different kind of coverage than you ever would have thought in 2020. But it ended up being, I think, and I would say like in the circle and all these other areas of coverage, like to keep softball alive during that time when we didn't have very many games and didn't have a whole lot to hold on to, I think ended up being pretty important. It was definitely important for my own sanity, but I think it was helpful what we all did for the softball community during that time. Then 2021 got to be a lot more fun with all the stuff that we actually got to watch and cover.
Well, if they're looking still for a wrestling person, I'm available. I'm down with that. I want to clear this up before my audience yells at me, because I looked this up. So that Alabama-Stanford, I want to clarify. The Alabama-Stanford Super Regional was Beth Mowins, Jessica Mendoza, which is kind of crazy to think about. She ended up doing your games.
Yes. Okay. I thought she did some of our games, but I didn't remember if it was that tournament. But that's right. Now that you say that, I actually remember Coach talking to her and stuff.
That's pretty cool. And then 2012, your last one was Adam Amin with Jenny Finch. And I've had Adam on the show. He started with Jenny Finch. It wasn't until, I guess, 13 or 14 we got paired with Scarborough, which turned into this incredible broadcast team.
Oh, yeah, they're great.
But thanks for reminding me about the wrestling. I have to get you back on maybe during the Rumble or WrestleMania season to get into that. Do you remember your first Pac-12 Network game?
Yes, it was Utah at Cal.
Who did you work with? What was going through your mind? This is like a big opportunity here. First, here on the Pac-12 Network.
Yeah. So what was actually super cool about it is that, so I was the analyst and my play-by-play partner his name's Jordan Watkins, and he and I actually do Stanford athletics together. So he's a Stanford football alum, and we had done work together for a long time on the Stanford live streams and those broadcasts. And then we actually got to have our Pac-12 debut together on Pac-12 networks for softball, because he does a lot of softball games with me too. So that was actually really special that we got to do that together, and kind of, and it also ended up being, I think, probably even a better broadcast, just because we know each other so well, and kind of the dynamics and even timing and things like that ended up working really nicely. So we got to do that series together, which was really cool. And then I did a series later with Kate Scott, which was Washington at Stanford. And I got to meet her, and I think it was really cool because she was like so experienced. Jordan and I got to do this new thing together that we were experiencing at the same time. And then I got to work with somebody who's so experienced and who was already sort of becoming a mentor like that quickly, even though we had just met. We just clicked really well. Another Cal Bear that I was surprised that I got along with so well. And then I got to really learn from her too, in terms of just a lot of the way things work, even like relationships with the crew and just everything. She was just a class act also. So I think that kind of intro was very cool to have like those two different experiences.
Yeah, because you don't have a set play-by-play partner. You kind of rotate, correct? It's kind of how that's been going?
Right, that's correct. And then last year was weird also because with COVID, I think certain people were like, okay, you live in Washington, you do Washington games. You're in the Bay Area, you do the Bay Area games. And it was much less, there's less movement and things. So it was just who was available and where you were located for the most part.
Who did you seek out for advice as you're broadcasting? You're trying to learn this craft, right? We're all still trying to figure this stuff out, even no matter how many years you do it. You know, you mentioned you've worked with different broadcasters. I work with different broadcasters. I personally like it because I could do different, you know, each person's different. So I can kind of spin some different things. Some don't. Some like to have that one partner and go with it. How do you feel about working with different people? Do you like it? Because you could do some different things. And then who did you seek out for kind of advice?
Yeah, I like working with multiple people. I think it's fun. I think it's more challenging, and I think you learn more that way too. However, not to say it's like, of course, you have certain people that you definitely vibe with the most,
Sure.
that are, you might be your favorites to work with or whatever that is. But I like doing it with multiple people. I think there's just more to it that way, because otherwise you can kind of get stuck in your normal routine. But I think it pushes you more to do that. And it ends up being, as a result, better for the audience in that case too. In terms of advice, I mean, from, like I said, back in 2013, Ramona was kind enough to let me visit her and sit in the sports center desk and all that stuff. So she's somebody that over the years, like once in a while, I'll get in contact with and get advice from. And she's like read some stuff I've written before. And I actually ended up, I took a sports journalism class during my master's at Stanford, and we had to do a feature story on somebody, and you could pick whoever it is that you want to do. And I did it on her. So I actually interviewed her parents, like other people close to her too, and did that. And so she saw my writing firsthand from that. But she's somebody who, from all angles, because like you said, she does radio, she's been on TV, she writes, like she does all different types of coverage. So she's just a great person to get advice from that perspective. I think Kate, even though we haven't known each other as long, just right away was just very kind and open and answered a lot of questions, even gave me unsolicited advice in a good way, like stuff that I was like, thank you for telling me that, you know?
Right. Well, and that's so important, right? It's
Yeah.
finding that person that's been willing to tell you about, hey, you might want to work on this, because a lot of people are too gun shy to do that.
Right. And also some people, you know, in our world, some people hold their cards really close
Yep.
close to their chest too. Just and I can understand why. I think it's hard, you know, like it's really competitive. It takes a while to kind of get up and running and pay your dues and all of that stuff. And so I can understand why some people feel that way, but I am very appreciative of the people who are just have like the helping hand and who are just wanting to help. And I remember telling Kate, you know, I've never really had like an actual total like mentor relationship with somebody. So I appreciated her kind of just opening up right away. And
Yeah.
she was like, oh, I kind of experienced that too, you know, so that I do want to help people. And anyway, it was a very nice, not everyone's like that. So it was like
No.
very nice to get that.
Especially in this industry. It's a very jealous industry. It's a competitive industry. So that's where that comes from. A lot of paranoia, taking your
Yeah.
spot, unfortunately. And then she's doing amazing, by the way. She's doing the Sixers games now. She did
Yes.
football on the radio nationally this year with Mike Golick. So
Yep.
that's a good one to also have from that standpoint. But you're right. It's such a competitive field that it's nice to have people you can trust that doesn't have an agenda, that they just, you know, hey, I want to help you out. And
Yeah.
I hope that's the case in softball. I feel like that's the next step for broadcasters. Let me a couple more questions. Put the analyst hat on.
Okay.
How does Jenna Becerra, the analyst, break down Jenna Becerra, the player?
Oh, well, if I had to summarize Jenna Becerra, the player, in one word, it would be versatility. So I played almost every position. I did everything but catch at Stanford, essentially. I ended up really being focused on playing the corners later on in my career. I even hit both lefty and righty, but then later in my career settled in and focused just on hitting right-handed. And I think if you look at the career as a whole, the way that I would say it as an analyst is that there was just clear growth. I think I reprioritized, particularly before my senior year, where instead of thinking and overanalyzing, which by the way, a lot of Stanford players tend to do that, they're just super cerebral. So it's just, you can get stuck in your head a little bit. I really just decided to just be myself, play, let the chips fall, leave it out on the field. And that was when I had my most successful year. And then that was when there were fun things like I was the first and only Stanford player to hit grand slams in back-to-back games, but the reason that even happened is because I wasn't in my head like, oh, I want to hit a grand slam right now. Like you have to let those things happen.
Right.
And so I think it's a story of perseverance. It's a story of things falling into place, ending on a really strong, solid, positive note. I remember I would go to Memorial Church at Stanford every now and again, like with some roommates. And I sat in this one pew. And if you look to the right on the wall, there were different quotes kind of throughout the church. And this is like the iconic church at Stanford that everybody always sees in the postcards and things. And the quote said something to the effect of like, we must not desire for all to begin by perfection, as long as we go on well and end well. And that kind of stuck with me because I was struggling my freshman year, in my head, and it was showing a little bit offensively. And that kind of ended up summarizing my career. I went on well and I ended well. And I think for me, I love defense. And I think that was clear too in the way I played. Third base was like super fun. Loved defending against slappers and all that good stuff. First base was fun too. It was different. I'm now like, I hadn't played first base really until college, and it was mainly it's like a little sophomore year, but mainly senior year too. And I think a really athletic, solid defender over at first base makes all the difference. Tori Vidalis and I have talked about this, like big proponent of that. But I just think defense, versatile, persevere, and good things happen.
You and Lauren Lappin, she's the same way. She loves defense. You all, what is it with you Cardinal people?
I've talked to her about that. And I actually talked to her about the versatile thing because, long story short, her versatility was, renowned, obviously. And it was part of what got her on Team USA, which was fantastic. But she and I have also talked about sometimes your versatility, it doesn't necessarily hurt you, but it can make things more difficult to where it's like, well, you can play anywhere. So you get to move around and do all these things. And it's like, but I want to be like the one, I want to be the starter at this X position, or I want to. And so she talked about how Coach Candrea used to say, like, you're my Swiss Army knife. And I could really relate to her on that level because I had a similar experience in that way at Stanford. So yeah, she's my girl.
I told Caitlin this, and both of them I told, because I've had them both on this year. I told them, when Caitlin was promoted officially head coach, the name that popped in my mind about, because that was a big speculation, is who's Caitlin going to bring in? And I feel a lot of people were like, well, maybe it's going to, which Wildcat alum is she going to add in? I'm thinking, I think Laura would actually make a lot of sense. Defense, they play together. I didn't know if it would happen. I didn't bring it up to him, but I'm like, I wonder if that's a move they'll go. And next thing you know, boom, it happened.
It's so perfect. Like, just what a great puzzle piece to finish it off with. Like, with the pitching with Tara Moat, and then Caitlin, just from outfielder's perspective, but that slapping perspective too. And then you have Lappin, who's a catcher and an infielder. It's just, you cover all your bases that way. It's so great. That's one of the teams I'm most looking forward to watching in 2022.
When you do the Pac-12 Network, how much does it help you that they know you are a Pac-12 person, that you are, you played at Stanford? Does that help when you kind of need to get, you either, and for those, this is like kind of behind the wall, but we all have conference meetings sometimes with coaches. We talk to them on the phone or whatever. We got to get details, kind of get a sense for the team. Sometimes we're allowed to talk to even players, depending, whatever. How much does that help that you all come from the same language, if you will, that you all understand each other from a Pac-12 standpoint, having played in the league, covering the league?
Oh, 1,000% it helps. I think especially because, like we talked about earlier, there are so many of the head coaches now that actually played now they're coaching at their alma mater. So they get it. They get what Pac-12 softball is. They appreciate that I get it. And also, some of these coaches were around when I played. So some of them kind of remember me, right? And they're like, oh yeah, like Jenna, when I talked to Coach Tar, like that happens. Or they weren't coaching there yet, but now they are. And I get to know them. And we talk about our experiences, like with Chelsea Spencer, Amy Hogue, at Utah. And it is like, I think there are some things in life where it's like, you don't know unless you've done it. And so some of that applies in this case too, with Pac-12. And I would say that that's true. If you look at other like power 5 conferences as well, like SEC softball is a unique atmosphere and there are certain unique things about it. You could say that about the Big 12. You could say that about the Big 10, you could say that about, and even the ACC with some of these up and coming like programs like Clemson and Duke. And there are certain things that are unique and that are special that you understand when you've been through it. So that's always going to help. And it definitely does.
Well, and then I don't know if you've covered Arizona State. Obviously, Trisha Ford coached you. She was the assistant at Stanford at the time under Coach Rittman. What was that like when you had to cover a game of hers and talking to, because you know her? And I've had Kenzie Fowler on, and that was a topic we came up. Like, what's it like when you do an Arizona game? Because you played for Mike Kendrea, so it's unique. Because on the one hand, you're asking, you have a job to do. He knows you got a job to do, but there's that obvious connection. And you in a part, Kenzie always joked. She was always worried, like, oh, is Mike gonna crack a joke on the air on her or stuff like that? What's that like? You covering Trisha, who obviously coached you?
Yeah, no, I would agree with Kenzie. Like, it's a funny thing, because in some ways it's really comfortable. In other ways, you're like, wait, yeah, what is going to happen right now? I think with Trisha, it was fun. It's even weird calling her Trisha because it was always Coach Ford,
Sure.
So that's even stuff like that is like an adjustment when you're in a different seat like this. But it's been fun. And it's something that's actually interesting because I can ask her certain questions about things that not everyone would maybe even know to ask, right? About like something that I know is her style at practice, or that I know that the language she uses when she's talking to her players or whatever it is. So there's that. And then of course there is some joking, but I think that that's actually fun, and that actually adds more and gives more value to people watching it. Like, if you can see those relationships and that familiarity, it's like, it is more entertaining, So I actually think it's fun. And I used to joke with Coach Ford that there was a girl on her team named Taylor Becerra, and she played third base. And, when I had her on the podcast, I've had Taylor on the podcast too. We joke that we're related, even though we don't think we are, but you never know. But when I had Coach Ford on, I was like, all right, like, on record, who's your favorite Becerra? Like, what's the deal?
Boy.
And she was like, you were the first one. I'll say that. I was like, fine, I'll take it,
whatever. That's a good answer.
I know, it's spoken like a true coach, right? But anyway, it having those added layers of the relationship, like, it always enhances, in my opinion.
But it does help the broadcast. I mean, because like you said, you kind of know her well enough to where you have a good sense, even though you're not around them, you have a good idea what they're doing and where she's coming from. So it's almost, it really kind of lessens the workload as opposed to somebody you don't know very well. From my standpoint, I don't know if the podcast has helped you like it's helped me. I've had guests on that I'm going to see them broadcast against UCF. So I have a feel for that team that I could talk about on the broadcast because I just spoke to them. Like 100%. Tim Walton, every year, Florida plays UCF. I talk to Tim every year. So I have a great perspective of what he's thinking, and I can share stories in my conversations with him on the broadcast that not others can. And you probably have that same ability with either Jessica at Stanford, with Trisha, obviously, at Arizona State. And that's kind of my favorite part about the broadcast is getting to talk to people and getting that sense and trying to relay that info and that story to the broadcast. And at the same time, kind of help you kind of prepare to prepare to see what you might see.
Yes, I love that part and that aspect as well. I think, and who knows, what if that did contribute to why Mike Kendrea was like, yeah, sure, let's talk right after he retired. I don't know. I do know that I think it did help. I know you and I have talked about before, the timing of when I was able to have Heather Tarr on Bleav In Softball was like right after, the bracket was released and the selection show and all that stuff. And there's a lot of crazy stuff going on with Washington. And I remember telling her kind of after we were done recording, like, hey, thanks. Like, I appreciate you. I know it's a crazy time. You're traveling, all kinds of stuff. And she was like, we take care of our people. Don't worry. Like, thanks. I was like, oh, well, thanks. I appreciate it. And so those things do matter. And I certainly multiple times have brought up, and I even asked like Pac-12 producers, like, hey, is it okay if I bring up some things that I've talked to them about that I could be relevant, here on the broadcast from the podcast? And they're like, yeah, absolutely, do it. And so that comes up often, actually, because you get to have that in-depth conversation on the podcast, and you can bring at least some of that to light in the broadcast. And that gives you that added just context and perspective. And that's what people want to know too. You also, when you have these relationships, you get to bring out maybe a little bit different side of these coaches than what people are used to seeing. Like, maybe I can kind of like get Coach Alistair to smile a little bit if I ask her a question in the middle of the game, even though that's not usually her style. You might be able to do that. And I think people find that interesting.
Well, that's why I like listening to your show. And you and I talk a lot off the air and stuff, and we compare notes like, hey, who you got on, who are you going to have on? Because
Yeah.
I feel like we both have this in common in that we like having conversations, and we want to make sure that the guest is comfortable and is comfortable enough to be open and talk about however whatever they want.
Yeah.
When I remember I had Tim Walton when Jen Rocha left, and he was very open with me about the process. No, he had not shared that. Like, hey, Patty Gassos called, and I just, Patty means a lot to my career. I'm not going to step in the way. I'm going to let him talk. Etc. He didn't have to open up, but he was comfortable enough to do that. I just had Jerry Glasgow on.
Yeah.
And he was very open. He opened up about his assistant coach hire. He had not even told this story to anybody else. He's done other interviews and stuff, but he shared it with me because, he's been on the show enough where he's comfortable talking on the platform because I give them the space. And I feel like you kind of do the same.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And I do think that does not only make for a better show, but we end up building better relationships with them because of that. And that I think is the bigger why for me as well. Like I love the content, and I think it's great that we do this and we provide this content to the softball community. I think it's great. But I also like that, especially with just all the craziness of these last 2 years, all the unprecedented things, not only in softball, but just in life that we've all had to deal with. For me, having this kind of resource in this community and this forum to be able to have those conversations, like even sometimes, it can be a grind, this, like to produce the podcast, it's not easy. It's a lot of work to do it every week and in multiple times a week. Like you guys release so many episodes, like you're all over it. And it's a lot. And so sometimes like I might be exhausted. I'm like, oh man, forgot I have to do this interview. Well, I never forget. I actually over prepare, but I'm always like, oh, this interview. Okay. I have to like psych myself up. And then afterwards, I'm always happy that I did it. And I always feel uplifted and like better afterwards because of that. So I think that's like a huge part of it too. Just the human element.
Yeah, I think we just like talking to people. In season's the hardest because we're doing broadcast. That is a priority.
Totally.
So fitting in the commitment. That's where Victor's been awesome on the show because he can fill in the blanks. If I'm not available, we have special guest hosts, stuff like that. Heck, you might be a part of that. Who knows? Last thing. What are your goals from a broadcaster standpoint as far as the analyst role and maybe even from a podcast host? So do you have goals? Do you set out things you're like, man, I want to do this year or down the road, etc. Like, I remember I had Coach Kenzie on, and she said one of her highlights was when she got asked to do the regionals and the super regionals. Yeah. Like that was a benchmark moment for her because it meant a lot that people thought enough of her work that she got to call a super regional and things like that. Do you have goals like that? What's your goals from a podcast standpoint, from an analyst standpoint?
Yeah, I think as an analyst, for me, it's expanding the exposure, not just for me, but also for softball. Cause that's the thing that I think also drives me is like, I really do believe in this sport and believe that the product is incredible. And all we have to do is continue with more and more exposure. And it's going to just continue to take off more and more. So with that being said, for me, like previously, like when I was just working with Stanford Athletics, it was like, all right, I'd like to try to get on TV and I'd like to work with Pac-12 networks because that's a natural transition. Right. And so that happened. So now it's like, yeah, I would love to kind of move forward into a more national coverage, essentially, of softball tour. Maybe it's not just Pac-12. Maybe it is doing some ESPN Plus work, covering other conferences or, preseason. I would say when the time comes for me to also hopefully be able to do postseason coverage, like regionals and super regionals, like Kenzie mentioned, that would also be an important milestone moment for me. So I think that kind of growth is what I'm looking for. And then I think from a podcast perspective, I had some like smaller goals between season 1 and season 2. And I think a lot of it was around the upgrades, like adding video to it. Like I created social media accounts, that we started promoting. We did a lot more of that in season 2 versus season 1 was kind of just audio and just me sharing stuff on my social media. But I think now it's about expanding that. I think actually, I remember season 1, a local newspaper here in Ventura County, the Acorn, actually picked it up and interviewed me and featured me in a couple other podcasts hosted by local folks, former athletes. And that was exciting. That was unexpected. And I was like, wow, that's really cool. I'm like, could I create a goal that's somehow like this. You know, I didn't expect this, but how can I kind of build on this moving forward? So actually, I didn't even tell you this, I don't think, before, but my goal this past year in season 2 is that I was like, you know what? Okay, I would actually, it would be great to be asked to be on other podcasts so I can talk more about softball and help others and actually just get to know other folks within our softball podcast community a little bit more. And so that ended up happening, you know, with us and with some others too, which was really exciting. So I think for season 3, I'm still thinking through this, because you know, you guys are grinding day in and day out, but we're on a break right now for Bleav In Softball. It'll come back in February, when season kicks off for college. And so I'm trying to think like, what can we do? And there's always, I think, you know, safe to say with you, I'm sure it's the same, where it's like, there's always goals in terms of like increasing number of listeners and, you know, maybe more engagement on social media, things like that. So there's always going to be those. But I think being able to maybe get certain guests too, like that. I know you said you want like Ramona Shelbourne, or, you know, so if I have a list of some folks like that too, that's kind of what I'm looking for. I think the podcast isn't both an outlet and kind of a constant area to create content and keep my skills going too. You know, like there's just so many pluses to doing it, even though it's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work, but it's fun. You know, like it's funny because you're right. We do a lot of shows, but it, you know, it's funny when we take a show off. People are like, "Why aren't you on?" And then there's kind of like that withdrawal. Like, man, why aren't we not doing a show? So that's that's why people ask. We don't take an off season. Part of it is like, I kind of like I could just record from my house. What else am I gonna do?
True. Yeah. True.
But one of the goals we've done is we have a lot of analysts from across the country. We've had Kenzie on for many years to break down the Pac-12 because we talk West Coast. So you're going to be a part of that for us next this upcoming season as well. So be careful what you wish for. You want to be a part of other podcasts. You made your debut with us at the Women's College World Series live and knocked it out of the park. So, but this was fun. I'm really glad we got to do this because I did want to dive into your career in depth, from a playing career and a broadcasting career. And I enjoy your show and I enjoy talking to you every day. So I'm glad you tolerate me for bugging you. Have a great year. I appreciate you doing this, and tell the audience one more time. You said February is the return of the podcast. Just tell the audience where they can find you.
Yep. So it's Bleav In Softball, BLEAV, with Bleav Podcast Network. You can follow on Twitter and Instagram at Bleav In Softball, and it's available anywhere you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, wherever else you listen. We got you. And then also on YouTube, Bleav In Softball too, so you can watch the episodes as well.
Jenna, this was a blast. Always enjoy talking to you. We'll be in touch. We'll definitely have you on during the season, especially as we get into Pac-12 softball. And I know you're going to be doing Pac-12 games. Look forward to that. In the meantime, be safe, and we'll talk soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Eric.